And now a little story from the apple seed.
So when I was a little girl, my parents didn't go to the school of the big box stores. When you go there, you see kids that are whining and crying, and their parents say, "If you behave, I'll get you this." My parents never said that to us. They said, "If you don't behave, you're going to get something." And my parents never doled out money. Everywhere I go, different stores and things, I see people just handing their kids cash. My mom and dad never just handed us cash. My dad had an interesting way of teaching us things. If it was a really good day, if my mom had had a good day, after dinner we'd get dessert. And most of the time, it was canned peaches in these melamine bowls. They were pastel color. And if she was in a really good mood, we got Cool Whip. And when she put that dessert in front of all the kids, we weren't allowed to touch it until my dad walked around with his spoon and took one bite out of each of our dishes. And he would say, "That's the government." So he had a way of teaching us things in a very interesting way, and you never dreamt of asking my dad for money without any good purpose and without ever having to earn it. But there came a time when there was something that I wanted that I thought that my dad would feel good about, that he would just kind of give me the cash for it. So I waited for the right timing. First, he came home whistling. That's a good sign. My mom was making his favorite meal, rolled sugared apples with kielbasa. And I thought, oh, he's going to be in a good mood, and tonight's the night I'm going to ask for the cash. So after dinner, my dad had sat back in his chair, and the little black and white TV was showing Walter Cronkite. And I thought, I'm going to wait till the news is over, and then I'm going to ask him. So I sat at the table, and my dad kind of kept eyeing me while the news was playing, and then he said, "Well, turn that off." And he said, "Tell me why you're sitting here hanging out with me after dinner." And I said, "Well, Dad, I have something that I want to ask you." And he said, "Okay." He said, "What is it?" I said, "Well, I need some money." "Oh, you need some money. All right. What do you need it for?" I said, "Well, Dad," I said, "I'm so tired of using my brother's fishing rods when we go fishing. Our family is really big on fishing. And I said, I'm just really tired of using hand-me-down rods, and there's a rod that I want, and if you could just give me the money for it, I would so appreciate it." And he said, "You know what? I respect that. We love to fish. You should have your own fishing rod." He said, "I'll be right back." And he left the table. And I sat there thinking to myself, I can't believe this. My dad is just going to go get the cash and hand it to me. The first kid in the history of our family is just going to be handed some cash. Well, I waited there really excited, and my dad came back, and I saw he had something in his hand, and my heart was kind of pounding, and I was like, I can't believe this, and I'm going to get get my fishing rod. I already had it picked out. And my dad sat down, and I saw in his hand was a piece of paper. And he slid it across the table, and on that paper were jobs that I could do to earn money. I resigned with a sigh, and I said, "Okay, let me look." So I went down the list, and there, number 4 was a job that I knew I would enjoy. Now, when I threw rocks down into Burke's Pond, I got in trouble, especially when I took out a barn window. When I threw my little sister around, I would get in trouble. As a kid, when you throw stuff, you get in trouble. But there on that paper was a job where I was going to get paid to throw things. And that's how I got my first newspaper route. I loved it. I would wait at the end of the school day. I would go to the end of the driveway and hook my fingers into the twine that held a large stack of newspapers, and I'd drag them into the garage. I'd snip the twine, and then I would take the newspapers, thwap it into my hand, roll it up, and then I had rubber bands down my arms, and I would snap one around each newspaper. And then I'd drop it into a big cloth bag made of canvas. And then there were always a few extra that I would put in the bike basket on my bike. I called it plicker. It was plastic wicker. And off I would go into the neighborhood. And I got to whip these things at people's houses. The first time I took my route, I was so excited. Top of dog box, left bush, front porch, top roof line, side left. I made all of my targets the best that I could, and it was absolutely wonderful. Well, one day when I was riding my bike down to deliver my papers through the neighborhood, and I need to explain this. My neighborhood wasn't like, rows of houses. It was a lot of farmland spread out, but with a lot of relatives that lived there, and then some come-heres that came later. Well, one day I was riding my bike down through to deliver the papers, and it wasn't long after I got the newspaper route. When I got down to Miss Della's house, and she came out and she said, "Stop your bike." Well, I pushed back on the pedals and left a black line on the macadam of the road, and she came out and she said, "Kimmy," she said, "I'm sick of you throwing that newspaper at my house onto the bushes." She said, "From now on, when you come down with the newspaper, you're going to stop and you're going to wait for me. And I'm going to come out and we're going to barter." Oh, I love to barter. She said, "I'm going to give you something and you're going to hand me the newspaper." And she was true to her word. Sometimes it was a little baggie full of red cinnamon hearts. Sometimes it was a fresh cut branch of lilac that I would stick into my basket and I could smell it the whole time I rode my bike. And then I'd give it to my mama as a gift. One time she went away and I held her paper for a few days. And when she came back, she gave me a little beaded woman on a rope that she had gotten on a trip that she had flown on an airplane to go on this trip. And I just thought that was the greatest thing that she brought me that back. Everybody loved Miss Della. How could you not love a woman like that? She had cornflower blue eyes and her skin leathered from the sun because she was always outside. She had a large hat that looked like a flour tortilla met a UFO. She always had on a shirt with kids standing around the world, holding hands, and wore sandals from the first time the sun peeked through the winter until the first snowflake fell from the sky. But there was a lot of reasons why we loved her. And I got a few I'm going to tell you, just because I need to help you understand this sweet woman. So she had gone to veterinarian school, but she only made it halfway through. And she had enough knowledge to make her dangerous. Now, I lived in an area where we had large animal vets come in for cows and horses and things like that, but we didn't have a companion vet, like a small animal vet. So she took that job on herself with half knowledge. And you could take anything there, a cat, a dog, a bird, a chicken, whatever, and she would try and work with it. But her husband, not one to miss an opportunity, became a taxidermist. And they put a little wooden burn sign on their door that said, "Either way, you get your pet back." So how can you not love that woman? She had a heart of gold, even though sometimes it went awry. Another reason that we loved her, especially the kids, was because she had a worm farm. She was ahead of her time. Before composting was popular, on the left side of her property, right at the line that was invisibly drawn of who owns what, she had all of these wood-stilted plastic bins, and on top were lids with holes. And in those bins, she had compost, and in that compost, she had red wigglers, the best fishing worm you could possibly use. How can you not love somebody that has a worm farm as a kid? That's the coolest thing ever. Well, the day came when I had enough money to get my fishing rod. And I told my dad, and he said, "Okay, I'll take you down to the Kmart." It was a big deal. We had just gotten a Kmart. And my dad came home early from work, put me into the Oldsmobile station wagon, and off we went to the Kmart. And I knew exactly where to go. I went back to the sporting goods area, and I picked up that blue and white Mickey Mouse fishing rod. I paid for it $9.99 in tax. I took it home and I pulled it out of that formed plastic front cover that was hard and peeled off the back cardboard. And I sat that fishing rod in the corner of my bedroom and I waited. Now, my dad's a fine fisherman, and you may think that he's the one that's going to take me fishing. My brothers are good fishermen, and you may think that they were the ones that were going to help me break that rod in. No. I was going to wait for my Uncle Howard. My Uncle Howard is the quintessential fisherman in our family. And so my mom put a call out to him that I had a new fishing rod and that I wanted to break it in. Well, sure enough, that Saturday, there was a loud knock on the door. I threw the door open and the smell of vanilla pipe tobacco came through the doorway as he lifted me up and spun me around and said, "There's my girl." He said, "I heard you got a new fishing rod." I said, "Yes, I did." He said, "You go to your bedroom and get it, okay?" I said, "Okay." Well, I ran back to the bedroom and I got it and I brought it out to him and he held it in his hand. And he said, "Oh, that's a fine fishing rod." He said, "Go down and get your bait bucket, and we're going to head out." I said, "Okay." Well, I went down to the basement to get the bait bucket. Now, I don't know how you all do it. How many fishermen? Okay, great. I can pretty much say anything, and you'll be like, oh, yeah, I know this. So I went down and got the bait bucket. Now, what we do is we have a bucket that has holes in the bottom, and then there's a rope that we attach to our belt loop on our jeans, because then we can put our bait in the bucket, and it trails behind us, and water flows through, and then the bait doesn't die, right? So I went down to get the bucket, and I found it, and I made sure the rope was attached. And as I was coming up the basement stairs, I heard my mother saying to my Uncle Howard, Howard, you better use the fishing rod. And I heard him say, Leanie, that's the whole point of this trip. Of course I'm going to use the fishing rod. As I turned the corner into the living room, my little mama was poking Howard in the chest saying, if I find out you didn't use that fishing rod. Now, you may think it's weird that my mom's saying that, but that's because my Uncle Howard was the president of the Noodlers Association of America. Now, if you don't know what noodling is or hand fishing, which I don't think you do, from how far we've gotten about fishing, I'm going to give you a really quick 101 just for you so that you know. Here's how it works. You have a footer and you have a noodler, and you got a bunch of guys and a cooler of cold Diet Pepsi. Depends on where you live. And they get in the truck and they go down to where the creek dumps into the river. They get out their gear and they go down to where the creek goes into the river. And there's a plot of land there between trees where it's worn down, where my brothers and my fathers and my father and my brothers and different relatives have fished for a long time. Well, they set up, and the noodler and the footer go into the water. Noodler in the front, footer in the back. The other guys sit on shore, drinking their cold beverages and waiting. They go in, and then the noodler goes underneath the water. He feels around for a hole. Now, if he finds a hole that is round and slick smooth, he doesn't put his hand in because that's a snake hole. But if he finds one that's oval and it has ridges, he doesn't put his hand in that either because that's a snapping turtle hole. But if he finds one that is oval and slick smooth, that's a catfish hole. So when he finds that, he comes up and he tells the footer, I found a catfish hole. Then he goes back underneath the water. He puts his hand in the hole. He moves his hand, and it looks like bait. And that catfish comes out of the back of the hole, and it chomps down on his hand. Then in the back of the throat, there's a bone that feels like a luggage handle. And he hooks his fingers in that, and he starts to kick. When he starts to kick, the footer takes his feet, locks them underneath his armpits, grabs his knees, and pulls him out. And as that catfish comes out of the hole, he thrusts that noodler's legs forward. They wrap around the fish, because if you don't have your legs around the fish, when it comes fully out, it'll turn like an alligator and you'll break your arm. After he's got his legs around that fish, then the footer takes his hands, shoves them underneath his armpits, locks them up, and then pulls that noodler and the fish to shore. When they get to shore, the footer then opens the jaws of the catfish. The noodler safely releases his hand, and there's the fish. This is when the guys who have been waiting do their job. They get up, they walk over, they surround the fish, and they go, all right. It's a big job. So that's why my mom was telling my Uncle Howard, you better use the fishing rod, because she didn't want me noodling. So off we went, and we went to Miss Della's to get some bait. When we got to Miss Della's, we didn't even knock because it was early morning. We could tell it was going to be a nice day, and we knew she was going to be outside. So we went around the side of the house where the bins were that held the worms, and sure enough, there she was. She had the lids off, and she had gloves that went up to her elbows. She had 2 utility buckets, and she was dumping them into each bin and then digging her arms in and pulling up and digging her arms in and pulling up. My Uncle Howard said, Miss Della, what are you doing? She said, well, I made a deal with the little diner up in Locust Grove, and they give me twice a day all of their eggshells and their coffee grounds. She said, it's wonderful. It makes fantastic compost. We walked over and she looked and she said, Kimmy, did you get your fishing rod? I said, yes, I did. She goes, girl, your first round of bait is on me. Well, I had my bucket at my side, and they commenced to talking while I started looking for red wigglers. Red wigglers are thick, shiny, flashy, juicy, and wigglers. The perfect thing for the end of a fish hook. Well, I began to dig for some red wigglers, and every time I uncovered some, they'd wiggle down in. And I'd uncover some more, and they'd wiggle down in. And finally, almost 11 minutes later, it took me that long just to get a handful of bait and put it in my bucket. Well, we took off. And I was pretty excited about this. We went to where that beautiful worn-down piece of land was, and my Uncle Howard looked at me and he said, "Kimmy, suit up that rod." Well, I got my fishing rod and held the hook in my hand with the rod here, and I reached into the bucket to pull out a worm. But those red wigglers had taken and knotted themselves into a red wiggling ball. And I would pull a worm, and it wouldn't come loose. And I would pull another worm, and it wouldn't come loose. Finally, he looked at me and he said, "Kimmy, what's taking you so long?" I said, "I cannot get these worms to come apart that I can pull one, and you don't want to kill them. You want live bait." And he said, "Give me the bucket." So I handed him the bucket, and he put it under his arm, and he reached in, and he tried to pull a worm, and it wouldn't come loose. Then he tried to pull another worm, and it wouldn't come loose. And he said, "I don't know what is wrong with these worms." He said, "You know, they smell funny." I said, "What?" He said, "They smell like something familiar." And then he held the bucket up to his ear, leaned in and listened. And he said, "Kimmy, they're making noise." I said, "What?" He said, "They are making noise." And he took the bucket, steadied it on the palm of his hand, leaned it forward, and let me listen. I leaned in, took a sniff, turned my ear, and I heard it. Boopy doopy doop boop. Boop boopy doop boop. If you're under 30, just ask anyone in here over 30. I looked at him and I said, "I know that song is from that coffee commercial." He said, "Yes, it is." He said, "I think these worms are juiced up on caffeine." He said, they're juiced up on caffeine. And no sooner did he say that than that red wiggling ball of worms hit the side of the bucket, tipped it out of his hands. They rolled into the water, went down that river, and sunk. And I looked at him and I said, "What are we supposed to do? We don't have any bait." And he looked at me and he said, "Girl, roll up your pants." I rolled up my pants, laid down my fishing rod, and he said, "We're going to go noodling." I was so excited. He said, "We're going to keep it small." So we stayed along the shoreline, and he felt around, then he found a little hole. And he said, "You know what to do?" I said, "Yes, sir." And I put my hand in, and I wiggled, and that catfish came up, and it chumped onto my fingers, and I felt a little bone in the back of its throat, and pulled it out of the hole, and it hung there. And I said, "Uncle Howard, I did it." And he said, "Let it go." And I released it off of my hand, and downstream it went. We did that 3 times. And he looked at me and he said, "Are you getting tired of the little ones?" I said, "Yes, sir." He said, "Okay, do you know what to do? You're going to follow me into the water, okay? And when I find a hole, when I start kicking, you grab my feet." I said, "Yes, sir." And so we went into the water, and the water was bobbing between my lip and my nose and my lip and my nose as I followed in his wake, moving with the water. And then he stopped just as my tiptoes were digging into that wet bottom. And he said, "This looks like a good spot." He went underneath the water, and it went still. And then all of a sudden, he broke surface, flicked his hair in a Bo Derek move, and he said, "Girl," he said, "I found a big old catfish hole here." He said, "I heard tell of a catfish here called the Undertaker, and I think this is its hole." He said, "Are you ready?" I said, "Yes, sir, I'm ready." He went back underneath the water, and I watched the bottom rubber soles of his shoes. And then they began to kick furiously. So I grabbed his ankles and I pulled with all the strength I had, locked him underneath my armpits, and then felt right below his knees and grabbed on hard. I pulled and I pulled and I pulled, and I could see the glinting head of that catfish as it slowly came out of its hole. And then that catfish began to break surface. And before I could release the legs, everything went slow motion, like a Wild Kingdom sponsored by Mutual of Omaha. And for a moment, I was looking, that catfish was looking deep into my soul, and I was looking deep into its soul, which I know is theologically incorrect, but it's my story. And as it looked at me in that slow motion second, I saw that its eye was rolling around wildly in its head, and I thought, I've seen that look before, when my dad has too much coffee and nothing to eat. And that's when I realized in that split second that that catfish had consumed that double red wiggler espresso. And we were the idiot baristas that had served it. I got my wits about me and I shoved his legs forward. He wrapped them around the catfish, and when he did, that catfish came full surface and it shot downstream in a caffeinated jerk. And my Uncle Howard had been holding onto that bone handle, legs around that catfish, and when that catfish took off, he lost his grip and his hand went all the way to the back inside tailbone of that catfish. There he was, going downstream, legs around that catfish, arm the whole way down inside that catfish, its lips slapping up around his neck. My Uncle Howard had a fish hickey for a week. And I even made an album with his story, and his wife still don't believe it. Well, I stood there hopeless. I had nothing I could do. He was gone. I didn't even know if he was going to be back. I stood there rocking in the waves of the river. And then I heard it, and then I saw it. My Uncle Howard riding that fish. Help! 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 And on that third time, out of my peripheral vision, I saw my blue and white Mickey Mouse fishing rod, and I thought, my time has come. I went back to shore, picked it up, went to where a tree had felled into the water. I wrapped my legs around it, locked tight, and I waited for the exact right moment. Help! And I released that line, zzz, hooked onto his Wrangler belt jeans loop, brought him to a complete dead stop. His arm came flying out of that fish. He was still holding on to the inside, and when he pulled his arm out, he turned that catfish inside out. That slick internal tail slipped from his fingers, and that catfish went downstream. Bones once on the inside, now on the outside. Its heart hanging off its chest, pumping, pumping, pumping. Black eye sockets looking back at me, and its gills opening and closing, winking silver skin that was once on the outside, once on the inside, now on the outside. And then it sunk into the water and disappeared. Well, I reeled in my Uncle Howard and unhooked him, and we went to shore. And we just both plopped down. We were dead tired. And he said, man, girl, that was some fine fishing. Don't tell your mama. He said, I bet you're tired. I said, yes, sir, I'm tired. He said, well, I'm tired too. I said, I bet you are. I said, that catfish gave you a ride 3 times. He said, I know how many times it gave me a ride up and down. He said, I bet the fish is tired. It'll never be the same. I said, no, it won't. He said, well, I bet they're tired too. I said, they? Who? He said, the people listening to this story. He said, you've been pulling their line for 20 minutes. And they bought it hook, line, and sinker. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us for a little story from the Appleseed.